spring of 1962. In the sweltering heat of Cameron Parish, Louisiana, state biologists drag heavy, waterlogged wooden crates deep into a stagnant marsh. They pry open the lids and dump dozens of thrashing, armor-plated juvenile American alligators directly into the black water. At that exact moment, the Louisiana bayou was practically dead. After decades of relentless, unregulated slaughter, the undisputed king of the swamp had been entirely wiped out, leaving a massive ecological vacuum. Without these animals, the waterways were suffocating under thick mats of invasive weeds, and pest populations were exploding completely out of control. Dumping those reptiles into the mud was not just a localized rescue effort. It launched one of the most aggressive, counterintuitive conservation experiments in American history. To understand how a dozen of prehistoric hunters resurrected a dying ecosystem, you first have to look at the massive human greed which destroyed it in the first place. By the 1960s, an entire generation in Louisiana had grown up surrounded by unnervingly quiet swamps. This is a classic shifting baseline. When you only know a degraded landscape, you assume the silence is natural. People looked out over flat, still expanses of water covered in thick mats of floating weeds and thought they were looking at a healthy wilderness. They were actually looking at a ghost town. The swamp was missing its engine. The ecological cost of removing the American alligator was catastrophic. You have to look back at the early 1900s to understand the scale of the slaughter. Unregulated commercial hunting decimated the species. Hunters killed hundreds of thousands of alligators every single year. Spotlights illuminated nighttime hunts. Poachers dragged massive reptiles onto muddy banks, stripping their hides for shoes and belts for the growing fashion industry. When the last giants were pulled from the water, the fundamental architecture of the wetland collapsed. The alligator was the biological enforcer. Without a top predator patrolling the black water, the middle of the food web exploded. Raccoons and possums multiplied unchecked. Then, the invasive species took over. Nutria rats, giant semi-aquatic rodents imported from South America, escaped into the bayous. Without the constant threat of giant jaws to keep them in check, these rodents bred exponentially. A single female nutria can produce up to 15 offspring in 1 year. This is where the invisible loss became physical destruction. These unchecked mid-level mammals needed to eat constantly. Swarming the marsh edges, they stripped the native grasses down to the mud. Nutrias did not merely graze. These invasive rodents dug down and devoured the root systems. This overgrazing destroyed the intricate biological web that physically held the delicate marsh soil together. Once the roots were gone, open water washed the mud away. The physical land literally dissolved into liquid. Hundreds of thousands of acres of wetland shifted from complex ecosystems into shallow biological deserts. The water itself changed. Without the constant movement of massive armored bodies tearing through the mud and dragging trails through the dense vegetation, narrow channels clogged. Sunlight could not reach the bottom. Oxygen levels plummeted, suffocating the native freshwater fish. Bird populations suffered just as heavily. Great egrets, herons, and ibises rely on the deep swamps to nest and raise their young. Normally, these birds build nests in the branches of cypress trees, directly above alligator territory. They do this on purpose. The alligators act as a terrifying, lethal moat. Reptilian jaws eat any raccoon, bobcat, or snake attempting to swim across the water to steal delicate bird eggs. When commercial hunters eradicated the alligators, they drained the moat. Raccoons waded through the shallow, unguarded water, climbed the ancient cypress trees, and devoured entire generations of wading birds before they could even hatch. The skies over the bayou went empty. The silence of the 1960s bayou was not peaceful. It was the silence of a dying patient taking shallow breaths. Coastal residents watched their cultural heritage slowly rot away, accepting this degraded reality as a normal fact of modern life. Biologists realized that saving the swamp meant bringing back the monster that ruled it. They needed an armored eating machine to restore the balance. They had to put the teeth back into the mud. But that was not the craziest part. The push to bring these massive reptiles back from the brink of extinction was controversial. Local residents were terrified and furious. You have to remember the cultural context of the time. The government was asking citizens to support the deliberate release of a known man-eating predator directly into their backyards. Public perception was hostile. People saw alligators as nothing more than vermin. These animals were viewed as dangerous pests that killed hunting dogs and threatened children playing near the water. But two state wildlife biologists refused to back down from the mission. Ted Jonin and Larry McNeese worked for the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. Stationed at the Rockefeller Wildlife Refuge, a massive tract of coastal marshland serving as their primary outdoor laboratory, these researchers understood something the general public missed. The alligator was not just a mindless killer, it was a biological bulldozer. This predator was the structural foundation of the wetland landscape. The mechanism behind their survival strategy is called ecosystem engineering. Alligators actually terraform their physical environment. They change the physical shape of the mud and the flow of the water to suit their exact needs. During the brutal heat of the southern summer, shallow coastal marshes frequently dry out. The mud bakes into solid clay under the sun. Fish suffocate. Turtles die in the heat, but the alligator refuses to die. When water levels drop, the alligator goes to work. Muscular tails, heavy snouts, and sharp claws aggressively excavate the mud to create deep, wide craters known as gator holes. These excavated basins reach deep down into the water table. When the rest of the marsh dries up, these gator holes hold the only standing water for miles in any direction. They become desperate, crowded emergency refuges. Every surviving fish, crab, frog, and turtle in the area retreats into these isolated pools. The alligator gets a highly concentrated, easy food source, but the prey species get something much more important. They get a chance to survive the lethal drought. When heavy seasonal rains finally return and the marsh floods again, the surviving fish leave the gator holes and swim out to repopulate the entire bayou. Without the alligator digging those holes, the aquatic food chain would bake and die in the dry mud. Alligators also build massive architectural nesting mounds. A female will scrape together a giant pile of rotting vegetation, sticks, and mud to lay her eggs. These mounds easily reach 3 feet high and 6 feet wide. Rotting plant matter generates internal heat, acting as a natural incubator for the leathery eggs hidden inside. But these mounds also create vital high ground in a flat landscape. During severe floods, snakes, small mammals, and insects use these abandoned mounds to stay above the rising water. The biologists realized they did not need to manually replant the dying marsh grasses. State agencies did not need to artificially dig deeper channels or spend millions of dollars shooting the invasive nutria rats. They just stepped back and let the alligators terraform the swamp. They let the ultimate predator rebuild the complex food web from the top down. And then the math changed. Skeptics laughed at the Rockefeller Wildlife Refuge experiment. Critics claimed releasing a few hundred relocated gators into a dying habitat was a waste of state resources. Skeptics argued the animals would simply starve to death in the ruined ecosystem or get shot by local poachers looking to make a quick profit on the black market. The ecosystem appeared too far gone to ever recover. The validation pivot happened faster than anyone predicted. Clinical data proved the skeptics wrong. In 1967, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service officially placed the American alligator on the endangered species list. The federal government formally acknowledged that the species was on the brink of biological collapse across its native range, from Texas to North Carolina. But Louisiana had a massive head start. Because of aggressive management, localized hunting bans, and strategic relocation programs championed by biologists like Jonin, local populations were already beginning to stabilize and establish new territories. The state initiated a rigorous, dangerous monitoring program. Helicopters conducted low-flying aerial surveys, skimming just above the tree line to count massive nesting mounds scattered across the remote coastal parishes. Field teams tagged captured animals and tracked the survival rates of newly hatched juveniles. The numbers recorded in official reports were staggering. When you give an apex predator a strict layer of legal protection, remove commercial hunting pressure, and leave it alone in a fertile wetland, the biological rebound is explosive. The nutria rat population plummeted violently as alligators resumed their rightful role as the primary population control mechanism. With destructive rodents being hunted and eaten by the giant reptiles, native marsh grasses finally had a chance to grow back. Vital root systems took hold in the soft mud again. The physical dissolving of the marsh slowed down significantly. Deep gator holes returned across the landscape, providing crucial habitats for freshwater fish during harsh summer droughts. Clogged waterways cleared up as the animals smashed through thick vegetation. Great egrets, herons, and roseate spoonbills returned to the upper canopy in deafening flocks because their armored, cold-blooded bodyguards were back on patrol at the base of the trees. By 1987, just 20 years after being placed on the endangered species list, the recovery was so overwhelming that the federal government officially delisted the American alligator across its entire range. A 20-year turnaround for a slow-growing apex predator is historically unprecedented. It remains one of the most successful wildlife conservation efforts in modern global history. Today, the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries monitors a wild, thriving population of over 2 million alligators. Think about that scale. The state went from a functionally extinct ghost population to 2 million active ecosystem engineers constantly churning the mud, digging the holes, and guarding the birds. They saved the bayou by reintroducing the monster that built it. What happened next defied every possible outcome. The Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries had a terrifying new problem on their hands. By the late 1980s, officials had successfully engineered the return of 2 million apex predators. But 2 million hungry reptiles require massive physical space and a practically limitless supply of fresh meat. The state quickly realized they had a terrifying mathematical reality to deal with. The rapidly expanding alligator population had outgrown the protected boundaries of the state wildlife refuges. Reptiles were spilling out into privately owned land, and you simply cannot force local residents to peacefully coexist with millions of dangerous prehistoric predators based solely on environmental goodwill. To save the species from a second wave of unregulated eradication by angry locals, Ted Jonan and his research team had to make a ruthless pivot. Researchers realized they could not rely on state government conservation funding forever. They had to commodify the monster. The American alligator had to become a profitable cash crop. This team pioneered the global alligator ranching program. This is the brutal twist that makes purist environmentalists deeply uncomfortable. The state allowed private landowners and licensed trappers to harvest wild alligator eggs. Every single summer, trappers take loud airboats deep into the suffocating heat of the marsh. They physically fight off protective mother alligators using long wooden poles, carefully packing wild eggs into insulated coolers. These harvested eggs are transported to controlled, state-inspected indoor incubation facilities. Commercial farmers use precise temperature controls to actually determine the biological sex of the hatchlings. Facility managers raise these young alligators in heated concrete tanks, feeding them a high-protein diet until they reach exactly 4 feet in length. Here's where the strict legal mandate kicks in. Private farmers are legally required by the state of Louisiana to return a specific percentage, usually around 10%, of those healthy 4-foot-long juveniles back into the exact same wild bayous where the eggs were originally collected. A 4-foot alligator has almost no natural predators in the swamp, so its survival rate in the wild is incredibly high. But what happens to the other nearly 90% of those captive raised animals? They are systematically harvested. Hides are skinned, heavily salted, packed into shipping containers, and sold directly to high-end European fashion houses in Paris and Milan. Luxury brands turn them into handbags, expensive belts, and custom boots that sell for thousands of dollars. The meat is processed and sold to local restaurants across the American South. It is an aggressive, unapologetic system of conservation, funded entirely by luxury global commerce. This created a bitter ethical divide. Animal rights organizations strongly condemn the entire practice. Activists argue that saving a wild animal by turning it into a mass-produced, slaughtered commodity is morally bankrupt. But state biologists simply point to the clinical data. The wild population is stable at 2 million animals. More importantly, because alligators are financially valuable, private landowners suddenly have a massive economic incentive to protect fragile wetlands. Instead of draining the swamps to build parking lots or strip malls, developers protect the marsh because the marsh produces a lucrative annual crop. The alligator literally pays for its own habitat preservation. But there is a secondary wall approaching rapidly, and it is a biological nightmare that no amount of luxury fashion money can fix. The Louisiana coastline is experiencing catastrophic, unstoppable land loss. The state loses an area of physical land roughly the size of a football field every single 100 minutes. The land is physically sinking into the mud, and global sea levels are actively rising. Alligators successfully save the ecosystem they live in, but the physical bedrock underneath them is dissolving directly into the Gulf of Mexico. As the fragile coast sinks, heavy, corrosive saltwater from the ocean rushes violently inland, flooding the freshwater bayous. Alligators are tough and resilient, but they are strictly freshwater animals. They do not possess the specialized biological salt glands required to survive in pure ocean water for long periods of time. As intruding saltwater kills native freshwater marsh grasses and fills deep gator holes with toxic brine, alligators are forced into a desperate retreat. They have to move north. Fleeing the rising ocean, they march directly inland. Prehistoric predators are now appearing in suburban swimming pools, manicured golf course water hazards, and concrete highway drainage ditches. The biological boundary between the wild ancient swamp and the human suburbs has collapsed. The American alligator is a biological tank. If you look closely at the geological fossil record, this exact species has been crawling through the mud of North America for over 150 million years. It is an ancient, perfected, brutal killing machine. It survived the massive asteroid impact that wiped out the dinosaurs. It survived the crushing freeze of the deep ice ages. It survived the unregulated hunting frenzy of the early 20th century. This animal proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that it could successfully rebuild a collapsing ecosystem from the mud up. If you give an American alligator a quiet stretch of fresh water and enough dark mud, it will engineer a thriving wetland. It will forcefully dig the deep holes, build the vital high ground, and ruthlessly enforce the natural balance of the food web. But the alligator is currently facing a modern threat it cannot dig its way out of. You cannot terraform an ocean. You cannot build a protective nesting mound out of rising saltwater. The ultimate survivor is now trapped in a slow-motion race against coastal geology. The future of this apex predator is no longer in the hands of greedy poachers, luxury fashion designers, or dedicated wildlife biologists. Its survival is tied to a vanishing coastline that is permanently being swallowed by the sea. The swamp is sinking, and the monster has nowhere left to hide. If you thought watching an armored reptile rebuild a dead swamp was a display of raw biological power, wait until you see what the next subject did to the physical geography of a different continent. Click the video on your screen right now to see how a handful of relocated furry predators changed the actual course of rushing rivers. You will never look at the mechanics of nature the same way again.